When dawn broke over Marrow Creek that Monday, the storm had washed the world clean, but the air still smelled of smoke. The jail stood quiet, its roof dripping from the night's rain. The melted key lay like a scar in the mud, cold and twisted, and Sheriff Daltrey stared at it as though it might explain everything. But it didn't. It couldn't. The boy was gone, vanished into the morning mist, leaving only that strange black triangle scratched into the ground behind him. Within hours, word had spread across every inch of the county. The Holloway boy had escaped. Some said the sheriff was incompetent. Others whispered that the fire itself had set him free. The press from Augusta even sent a man down to write about it, though he returned less than a day later, pale and shaking. He claimed the woods around Carter Road hummed at night, that sparks moved through the trees like eyes. Nobody believed him then. Not yet. Sheriff Daltrey gathered a team of men and rode out toward the Holloway farm just after sunrise. The house was silent. The door was open. Margaret Holloway sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling over a teacup gone cold. Jonathan Holloway was nowhere to be found. A trail of wet footprints led from the back porch around the barn and into the field, disappearing into the tree line beyond. When the sheriff asked what had happened, Margaret looked through him as if he were invisible. "He came home," she whispered. "He just wanted to see the fire again." The men followed the prints until the ground turned soft and uneven beneath the pines. That's where they found the first body, Jonathan Holloway, lying face down, soaked from the night's rain. His back was burned, but the surrounding earth was untouched. His left hand still clutched the handle of a lantern, its glass burst inward. There was no flame, no fuel, no trail of ash. It looked less like fire had killed him, and more like something inside him had burned out. Margaret was taken to the rectory for her own safety, though people avoided her. She hardly spoke. Sometimes she'd hum old hymns under her breath until the sound curdled into sobs. At night she would stare from her window toward the woods, waiting for something, or someone. The women of the church brought her food, but she barely touched it. All she ever asked was whether anyone had seen her son. By now Marrow Creek was divided. Half the townspeople believed Peter was dead, gone into the swamp to rot. The other half believed he was still out there, watching from the shadows. The fires that had plagued them all summer had suddenly stopped, as if holding its breath. The sheriff took the silence as a good sign, but he would later say he should have known better. After all, fires always pause before they spread. It was 3 days after Jonathan's body was found, when children playing by the river discovered something buried beneath the banks. A box charred on one side and sealed tight with a strip of metal. Inside were 5 small items: a rusted pocket knife, a glass marble, a broken comb, a matchbook with only one match inside, and a folded scrap of paper. On the paper, drawn in faint graphite, was the triangle symbol again, this time surrounded by tiny initials, each corresponding to one of Peter's friends from school. The sheriff's deputy recognized 2 of the names immediately. One belonged to Matthew Rivers, the boy who had burned in the barn. The other was Thomas Greer, eldest son of the man who had lost his horses earlier that summer. No one had seen Thomas in nearly a week. At sunset that same day, the town bell rang from the church tower. A fire was seen in the distance again, not a small one, but a blaze that rolled like thunder from hill to hill. The air shimmered orange above the treetops. Men grabbed buckets and rifles. Women screamed for their children. The sheriff's horse was saddled before he even finished shouting orders, and once again they rode toward Carter Road. What they found there hardened every man's face to stone. The Holloway barn had collapsed into a smoldering inferno, every beam glowing red against the dusk. Around it stood 6 figures, or what was left of them, arranged in a circle, hands clasped, heads bowed together, their clothes fused into their skin. In the center of the ring, burned into the dirt, lay Peter Holloway's school boots. Inside one of them, ashes still smoked faintly, rising in slow curls into the night air. The town's priest led a prayer, while others picked through the ruin. By morning they counted the victims, Thomas Greer among them and 2 others, both boys from Peter's class. That discovery silenced the last of the doubters. Peter Holloway, now 16 years old and nowhere to be found, had lured his friends to their deaths. What nobody could explain, however, was how every one of them had been positioned so precisely, as though they had willingly taken part. Sheriff Daltrey wrote the report himself that evening. He kept his words simple. Cause of death, fire. Culprit unknown. Victims arranged in circle, but years later people who handled that report said it smelled faintly like smoke. For a while after that night, the fires stopped again. The town began to rebuild. Sawmills reopened, stores resupplied. Margaret Holloway was moved to an asylum in Atlanta, where she died before winter. Her final words, recorded by the attending nurse, were, "He wanted to burn his loneliness away." Nobody knew what she meant. Autumn came, and Marrow Creek tried to forget. Time, they say, makes even horror fade. But one evening, late September, the wind changed. The nights grew colder, drier, and from the woods where the Holloway farm once stood, hunters began to whisper that sometimes, when the moon was thin, they saw a faint orange flicker between the trees, like a small campfire that vanished when approached. It was nearly midnight on October 2nd when the sheriff received a knock at his door. A young woman stood there trembling. Her eyes were wide, her breath shaking. She said she'd been walking home along the creek when she saw a boy standing near the bridge, holding a lantern. His face was pale, his clothes torn, but his eyes shone like burning glass. She froze when she recognized him. Peter Holloway. He didn't speak, she said. He only held out the lantern and pointed toward the woods as if inviting her to follow. When she ran instead, his voice drifted after her through the dark, steady and almost calm. "It's cold out here," he said. "Don't you want to be warm?" By morning, the woods beyond Carter Road were burning again. It began on a sweltering evening in the summer of 1893, when the air in rural Georgia clung to the skin like hot syrup, and cicadas shrieked from the pine trees until the night seemed to throb with their endless rhythm. Marrow Creek was little more than a road between two dusty towns, a cluster of farmhouses, a mill, a chapel, and a general store where rumors traveled faster than news. But that summer, something started there that would scar the South's memory for decades. The horrifying crimes of Peter Holloway, the boy who fed the fire with his friends. The Holloways arrived in town in late April, hauling a wagon stacked with furniture and wrapped in grey tarps. Jonathan Holloway had taken work at the lumber mill, proud to move his family away from city turmoil. His wife, Margaret, was a strict but gentle woman, the kind others called proper. And Peter, their only child, was a boy of 16 with a hollow face, pale eyes and a silence that made people uneasy. Neighbors said Peter never quite blinked right. He'd listen with this faint smile, as if pretending to understand what emotions were supposed to feel like. He helped his father on the property, chopping wood, repairing fences, painting the porch. But when the day ended, Peter lingered by the bonfire behind the barn, staring into the flames without moving. Most boys his age would toss in sticks or poke the ash, but Peter just watched, like he was waiting for the fire to speak. At first, nobody thought much of it. Boys got strange in the country, bored and restless. But on June 3rd, the first fire broke out, the carpenter's tool shed behind the church. The blaze came sudden, roaring so fiercely that it woke half the town. A shell of smoke hung above Marrow Creek until dawn. The sheriff blamed the heat. Still, people whispered that Peter had been seen near the site that evening, walking along the path with a lantern in his hand. 2 weeks later, the old Greer barn went up next. This time, something was different. The horses were trapped inside. Their screams pierced the night, shredded by the sound of crackling beams collapsing into the hay. When the fire died down, townsfolk found a mark carved into the wood near the barn doors, a triangle circled twice, drawn by hand, black with soot. The sheriff frowned when he saw it, muttering something about mischief, but his deputy swore he'd seen a boy's boot prints circling the building. Peter's mother insisted on clearing his name. She brought the sheriff to the farmhouse, saying Peter had been home the entire night. The boy stood quietly by the window while the lawman asked his questions, barely answering, eyes reflecting the late morning sun. When the interrogation ended, the wind pushed the ashes from his sleeve onto the wooden floor. By July, fear wrapped the town tighter than the summer heat. Parents kept lanterns burning all night. Mills closed early. Down at the diner, old men began calling the arsonist the Carter Road Devil, after the lonely stretch where the Holloways lived. Nobody said Peter's name aloud anymore, but everyone thought it. On July 19th, the fire jumped from barns to homes. The Rivers family woke to the smell of smoke and fled into the fields. Their youngest son, Matthew, a friend of Peter's from school, was missing. They found him the next morning, lifeless among the ashes, His hands burned black, but his face strangely peaceful. Near his body, a circle of stones marked the ground, and carved into one of them, the same triangle symbol. Margaret Holloway began to unravel after that. She would roam the porch muttering prayers, clutching her rosary with red fingers. Her husband buried himself in work at the mill, refusing to discuss what people said. But Peter, according to neighbors, grew calm. He stopped going into town. Some nights, though, smoke could be seen in the distance behind the Holloway property, lonely spirals against the purple sky, too small to raise alarm but too frequent to ignore. Then came August. On the first Sunday of the month, the church gathered for morning service. It was the hottest day of the year. Even the priest looked half-melted in his robes. When the sermon ended, people poured outside, fanning themselves with hymn sheets. That's when one of the children, a small girl named Clara Green, screamed and pointed toward the hill behind the mill. A column of smoke rose skyward, thicker, darker, angrier than before. The mill was burning. Men rushed to form lines with buckets, shouting and coughing as sparks flew overhead. By the time they reached the main hall, the roof had already caved in. The heat was unbearable, spitting embers that scorched skin. Through the chaos, one figure stood apart, motionless on the opposite bank of the creek, Peter Holloway holding something small and blazing in his hand, a piece of burning cloth. He waited until several people spotted him, then dropped it into the water and walked away without a word. The sheriff had no choice but to arrest him. They brought Peter to the small holding cell in town, covered in soot but silent. Every question was met with a calm stare, every accusation with a slight tilt of the head. Finally, the sheriff slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know why. Peter blinked, leaned forward, and whispered a single sentence that made the sheriff's spine go cold. "I was feeding it." "What do you mean, boy?" the man barked. Peter's eyes flicked toward the candle burning in the corner of the room. The light danced across his face as he smiled softly, almost kindly. "Fire eats," he said. "It just doesn't have hands." The sheriff ordered Peter kept overnight before transfer to the courthouse in Macon. That night, a thunderstorm rolled through town. The lightning cracked above the cabin roof, shaking the walls. But inside the jail, Peter slept soundly. When the sheriff returned at dawn to check on him, the cell door hung open. The iron key melted clean through. The boy was gone. Outside, nothing remained but ashes, and in the damp soil beneath the jail window, the triangle symbol again freshly drawn. From that morning on, Marrow Creek ceased to sleep. Parents barred their doors. The sheriff doubled night patrols, and anyone who dared step out after sundown swore they could see a faint red glow drifting between the trees at the Holloway property. The next chapter of horror was only beginning. 20 years passed before anyone spoke Peter Holloway's name again. By 1913, Marrow Creek barely existed. The railroad had rerouted, the post office shut down, and most of the remaining buildings had sunk into the earth. Only the silhouettes of chimneys rose from the brush, like gravestones of a forgotten town. Travelers who dared pass through swore they felt watched, that the woods themselves seemed alive, whispering under their breath when the wind picked up, but the land still belonged to someone, at least on paper. A lumber company out of Atlanta purchased the area, planning to clear the forest and sell the timber. They sent surveyors first, young men with clipboards and optimism who knew nothing of the town's history. Among them was Samuel Hensley, 28, ambitious and eager to prove himself. He had never believed in ghosts, nor in stories told by dying towns. "Ashes don't bite," he joked when the locals warned him not to camp by the old Holloway property. He laughed when the bartender told him about the fires. "Coincidence," he said, "a myth born out of poverty and fear." By the end of that week, Samuel had learned how wrong he was. The clearing where the Holloway farmhouse once stood had grown wild. Only the stone chimney remained, blackened but intact. Samuel pitched his tent nearby, keeping a small fire for warmth. The night air smelled of pine and decay. As he sat beside the flames, sketching the tree line by lantern light, he noticed something odd. The wood burned too clean, too hot, without crackling. He tossed another branch in, but it vanished into the coals almost instantly, as if devoured. The light flickered low, then brightened again until it hummed. He frowned but said nothing. When he finally lay down to sleep, the forest had fallen silent. He woke near dawn to the hiss of dying embers and faint footprints circling his tent. They were small, clearly a child's pressed into the soft dirt, leading toward the chimney. He rose shakily and followed them. Near the base he found a half-buried object, an old lantern, its glass blackened, its handle still faintly warm despite the cold air. He carried it back to camp, curious but uneasy. Inside his journal, he noted the find and sketched the triangle symbol etched faintly into the metal. He had no idea it had been Peter's. Over the next days, Samuel's crew arrived to begin surveying. None of the men liked camping near the site. They said the woods felt hungry, the air too thick to breathe. Tools went missing overnight. Compass needles spun for no reason. One man claimed to see movement near the river, a young boy dragging a stick across the bank, leaving dark lines like burn marks. Samuel dismissed it all, determined not to be mocked by superstition. But that changed on the 7th day. It was a cloudless morning when they found the first of the fires. 3 trees stood burning from the inside out, their bark unscathed but their cores glowing red. The flames produced no smoke, only heat, unbearable, crawling, suffocating heat. The men fled back toward camp, shouting. Samuel stayed behind, staring in disbelief as the fire traced lines across the ground between the trees, forming shapes, triangles within circles, the same marks from the old reports he had dismissed as nonsense. "Get the water barrels," he yelled, but when the men returned, the fire was gone. Only black ash remained, shaped perfectly on the forest floor. That night one of his men, Caleb, went missing. The others found his boots neatly placed by the creek, his footprints ending in the shallows. Nearby in the snow, someone had drawn a single phrase with a stick, "Keep the fire warm." Samuel didn't sleep after that. He sat by the dying fire in the center of camp, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the tree line. Hours passed. Then, sometime after midnight, he saw it. A faint orange glow beyond the branches, like a lantern swaying slowly back and forth. A boy stepped into view, barefoot, clothes tattered, his hair pale as frost. He looked no older than 16, though his movements were wrong, too smooth, too deliberate. His face was quiet, expressionless. In his hand he carried the same lantern Samuel had found. Samuel's breath caught. "Who's there?" he called. The boy tilted his head but said nothing. Instead he lifted the lantern high and for an instant its light flared white. Samuel threw up his arm to block it. When he lowered it again, the boy was gone, and every ember in the campfire was burning white-hot, throwing off no smoke at all. By morning, 2 more men had disappeared. The rest refused to stay. Samuel tried to convince them to finish the job, but they packed their things and left on foot, abandoning their horses. Alone now, he gathered his notes, intending to leave by noon. Yet when he tried to ride south, the trail was gone. Trees that hadn't existed yesterday blocked the path, thick and interlaced like a barrier. He circled for hours, but every direction led him back to the chimney. There he saw movement again, the boy this time standing right beside the crumbling stones. His expression hadn't changed, but his hands were blackened, matching the soot that stained the earth. Samuel shouted and raised his rifle, but the boy only watched. "What do you want?" he demanded. The voice that answered wasn't loud. It came softly, barely above a whisper. "Warmth," the boy said. Then he vanished in a shimmer of heat, and the chimney ignited from within. Samuel ran. He did not stop running until the forest opened into fields again, flames licking at the treetops behind him. He collapsed on the road, just as a supply wagon came around the bend. When the driver lifted him up, Samuel's eyes were wild. He muttered one thing over and over, his voice split between a plea and a warning. "It's not dead. The fire remembers." The next day, the lumber company abandoned its plans. When investigators returned months later, the forest had regrown faster than it should have. No one found evidence of burns or bodies, just a clearing where the grass never sprouted, and a single stone chimney still standing, coated black with soot. The fire moved differently this time. It didn't roar or crack like the ones before. It crawled. Low and deliberate, it slithered along the forest floor, eating through dry leaves and rotted bark, spreading in a slow circle that glowed faintly through the fog. By the time the townspeople noticed, half the hillside was already smouldering. The smoke rose thin and grey, curling like fingers into the morning sky. Sheriff Daltrey organized another search, but this time he brought twice as many men. They carried axes, shovels, and rifles loaded with buckshot, though nobody was certain what good a bullet would do against a boy who seemed to vanish and reappear like smoke. The priest insisted on joining them, holding a leather-bound Bible under one arm and muttering prayers as they rode toward Carter Road. His presence offered little comfort. The woods felt wrong now, too quiet, too still, as though even the birds had abandoned the place. They reached the edge of the forest just after noon. The air was thick with ash, and the ground beneath their boots was warm. One of the men, a farmer named Lewis, stopped short and pointed toward a cluster of trees ahead. Between two blackened trunks, a crude shelter had been built from fallen branches and strips of cloth. Inside, the ground was scorched in a perfect circle, and at its center sat the remains of a small fire, still glowing faintly. Around it, arranged like offerings, were 6 more items: a child's shoe, a bundle of dried flowers, a rusted pocket watch, a sewing needle, a strip of burlap, and a single photograph, burned beyond recognition except for the corner, which showed part of a young boy's face. The sheriff crouched beside the circle and reached toward the ashes. The moment his hand crossed the edge, the embers flared. He pulled back sharply, cursing under his breath. The priest stepped forward and sprinkled holy water over the ground, but the fire only hissed and smoked, refusing to die. One of the younger men suggested they leave it alone, that maybe disturbing it would bring worse trouble. Nobody argued with him. They moved deeper into the woods, following a faint path worn into the earth. The trees grew denser here, their branches tangling overhead until the sunlight barely reached the ground. Every so often they found another mark, the triangle symbol, carved into bark or scratched into stone, always pointing them forward. It felt less like tracking and more like being led. After nearly an hour, they emerged into a clearing. What they saw there made every man stop cold. In the center of the open ground stood a circle of stones, each one blackened by fire. Inside the circle, arranged in perfect symmetry, were the skeletal remains of 7 animals: deer, rabbits, a wild hog, all positioned as if they had lain down willingly. Their bones were charred but intact, and between each one, a small pile of ash had been carefully shaped into the triangle symbol. The priest crossed himself and whispered something in Latin. The sheriff turned to his men and told them to spread out, to search the edges of the clearing. They moved cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning the shadows. It was Lewis who found the next clue, a piece of cloth tied to a low branch fluttering gently in the breeze. It was torn from a school uniform, the kind worn by boys in Marrow Creek. Stitched into the fabric, barely visible, were the initials PH. One of the men called out from the far side of the clearing. He had found footprints, fresh ones leading away from the circle and into the thickest part of the forest. The tracks were small, narrow, unmistakably those of a boy. The sheriff ordered everyone to follow, but as they moved forward, the air around them began to change. It grew warmer, heavier, until their breath came short and sweat dripped down their faces despite the shade. The smell of smoke returned, stronger now, clinging to their clothes and burning their throats. They walked for another 20 minutes before the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a ravine. Below, the creek ran shallow and dark, winding between rocks and fallen logs. On the opposite bank, standing perfectly still, was Peter Holloway. He looked exactly as he had the night he escaped, pale, thin, his clothes ragged and streaked with soot. But his eyes were different now. They burned with a light that didn't belong to any living thing, bright and steady, reflecting the fire that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The sheriff raised his rifle and shouted for the boy to stay where he was. Peter didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stared across the ravine, his expression calm, almost peaceful. Then, slowly, he raised one hand and pointed behind them, back toward the clearing they had just left. The men turned. From the direction they had come, smoke began to rise, thick, black, rolling through the trees like a wall. Within seconds, the forest behind them was ablaze, the flames climbing higher and faster than any fire they had ever seen. The heat pushed them forward, forcing them toward the ravine, toward the water, toward Peter. The boy smiled, and then he turned and walked into the flames. When the fire finally died 3 days later, nothing remained of the clearing but ash and bone. The sheriff survived, along with 4 of his men. The others were never found. The priest's Bible was recovered near the creek, its pages burned to dust but its cover untouched. Inside, someone had drawn the triangle symbol in soot across the first page. Peter Holloway was still out there, and the fires were only getting worse. By winter of 1893, Marrow Creek was a wounded town, burned, battered, and half-emptied. Fields lay dormant beneath layers of frost, their fences blackened. Charred skeletons of trees stood watch over what had been farms, and the old steeple bell rarely rang anymore. People left in silence, wagons heavy with what little they had. Those who stayed did so out of duty or stubborn disbelief. No one spoke Peter Holloway's name aloud. They referred to him simply as the boy, as if refusing to name him might strip him of power. Sheriff Daltrey tried to restore order, though his deputies had grown scarce. The fires had stopped after the search party's disaster, but the damage was done. Men drank earlier in the day. Women kept curtains drawn even under sunlight. Children whispered stories they shouldn't have heard, of a pale boy by the river, or lights that flickered behind the trees when the moon was gone. Fear seeped into the town like humidity, invisible but constant. One especially cold night in early December, the sheriff sat alone in his office, staring at the ledger where so many names had been crossed out. The lamp burned low, its flame quivering. Through the window, he saw pale mist crawling across Main Street, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw movement beyond the fog, a shadow gliding past the churchyard. He rose, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the cold. The town was silent, but for the crunch of his boots on frost. The air smelled faintly of smoke again. He crossed the square and pushed open the chapel door. Inside, the priest's desk candle had burned to a stub. The sanctuary was empty, except for one figure kneeling at the altar. Sheriff Daltrey's breath caught. The boy knelt perfectly still, head bowed, hands clasped as if in prayer. His hair looked lighter now, almost silver under the flickering light. "Peter," the sheriff said quietly. The name felt foreign leaving his mouth. The boy didn't turn. "What are you doing here, son?" he asked again, stepping closer, hand resting on his revolver. Peter's voice drifted like wind. "It's quiet here. For now." His tone wasn't defiant or afraid. It was something worse, empty. "They don't fight it anymore. The fire doesn't want the town. It wants what's left." Daltrey hesitated. "What's left of what?" Peter rose slowly, his movements precise. When he turned, the flickering candle caught his eyes. Not glowing, not supernatural, but hollow. Dead tired, yet burning with purpose. "Of me," he said. Then he smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "You can't kill a fire by locking it up, Sheriff. It follows what it remembers." The sheriff drew his weapon. "You'll come with me now. This ends tonight." The boy tilted his head, studying him like a puzzle. "It never ends," he said softly. Then he stepped backward, and the candle went out. The sheriff fired once. The gun's echo bounced through the chapel rafters, then faded into silence. When he struck a match to relight the lamp, Peter was gone. Only soot rimmed the altar carpet where the boy had knelt, in the faint shape of that cursed triangle. By dawn, snow began to fall. It blanketed the town's ruins, softening every sharp edge, masking the scars left behind. For the first time in months, Sheriff Daltrey allowed himself to hope that maybe, somehow it was over. But at sunset, a family returning from church found something half buried in the snow along Carter Road, a charred wooden cross. Attached to it was a scrap of paper that read in careful handwriting, "Keep the fire warm." The ink had smeared, but the words were still legible. Beneath them lay a child's mitten, small and burned at the fingers. After that, sightings came in waves. A farmer swore he saw the boy by the river, standing knee-deep in water that steamed despite the cold. A delivery driver claimed he found symbols carved into his wagon wheels overnight. A woman washing clothes behind the inn said she saw faint light moving through the woods, like an ember being carried by invisible hands. The sheriff chased every lead and found nothing each time. Nothing but the smell of smoke and the residue of ash. Margaret Holloway's grave was visited more than once that winter. Someone left small trinkets there. Burnt buttons, beads, scraps of paper folded into triangles. The gravedigger said it wasn't animals or children. Whoever came did so quietly, leaving no footprints even in fresh snow. The priest believed it was guilt, that the ghost of regret lingered, not the boy himself. But the sheriff no longer knew what to believe. He had seen too much, and what he saw didn't obey scripture or reason. Weeks passed. The new year loomed. Then, on the night of December 28th, the last fire consumed what remained of the Holloway farmhouse. Neighbors saw the glow from miles away. They said the flames reached over the treetops like arms stretching for heaven. The sheriff arrived before dawn, exhausted, but determined to end it. The ruins hissed under the snow, smoke rising slow as breath. In the center of the collapsed foundation, he found something buried beneath the ash, a circle of stones and, within it, one unburned old photograph. It was the Holloway family portrait, Father stern, Mother smiling faintly, and Peter standing between them holding a lantern. The sheriff slipped the photo into his coat. He didn't notice until later that the lantern's flame in the picture was fresh, drawn over in bright ink that hadn't existed in 1893. He never told a soul about that detail. But people said he stopped sleeping after that night. By the time spring came, Marrow Creek had become a ghost town in spirit, if not in name. Farms never reopened. The mill was abandoned. Only the blackened chapel remained. Its bell melted into silence. Travelers passing through said they sometimes saw faint orange light in the hills, the smell of smoke drifting where no chimney burned. And on warm nights when the air hung still and heavy, the wind carried faint whispers, the rustle of a boy's voice saying softly, almost kindly, "Fire eats. It just doesn't have hands." The sheriff left town soon after. Some said he went north, others that he went mad. But years later, when a new marshal came through that part of Georgia, he found an old farmhouse by the river. Inside, on the wall above the cold hearth, was carved the same simple triangle, blackened with soot. By the time the story of the Holloway land reached Atlanta, it had already twisted into legend. Newspapers called it the Cursed Timber Tract. Professors at local colleges debated whether strange heat spots or gas leaks explained the phenomena, while old preachers muttered about retribution and restless spirits. Most people dismissed it, but curiosity burns almost as dangerously as fire. In March of 1915, a professor from Mercer University, Dr. Walter Green, set out to investigate the story himself. He specialized in folklore and had made a career debunking Southern myths. He intended to do the same with Marrow Creek. Walter was a methodical man, rational, patient, and quietly stubborn. He arrived at the nearest surviving town, Fair Hollow, carrying notebooks, a camera, and a small team of 2 graduate assistants. Local ranchers tried to warn them off, but money and academic pride outweighed fear. They hired a guide to show them the forest, though the man refused to step beyond the first ridge. "Ain't nothing good grows past them trees," he said, before turning back toward town. They entered the woods alone. The remnants of Marrow Creek were easier to find than expected. The main road still cut faintly through the pines, and pieces of rotted fence marked where farms once ended. The chimneys stood like monuments, the last bones of a dead settlement. Beneath them, everything smelled of earth and ash. Walter's assistants, Clara and Henry, recorded measurements and took photographs, noting that some chimney stones were fused together like glass, a phenomenon Walter attributed to lightning strikes, rather than anything supernatural. He remained skeptical, though the silence unsettled even him. That night they camped near the old Holloway clearing. The stone chimney was still there, cracked but unfallen. They built a small fire, careful to keep it modest. The air was windless, the darkness heavy. Over tea they read from an old newspaper Walter had found in the county archive, the final letter written by Sheriff Daltrey before he left Georgia. "The fire knows what was taken from it," it read. "It will not rest while memory burns," Walter scoffed quietly. Folklore rhetoric. Nothing more. Still, sleep came uneasy. Shortly after midnight, Clara woke to the faint scent of smoke. She thought the campfire had caught the tent flap, but when she looked, the fire had already gone out. Only a halo of dying embers glowed faintly in the pit. Near the chimney, however, light shimmered, not a flame but warmth itself, twisting the air as though heat radiated from stone. She woke Walter and Henry. Together they watched as the air thickened, forming faint, moving shapes. Childlike, featureless at first, then clearer. 3, maybe 4 small silhouettes circling the chimney. Walter stepped forward, convinced it was an optical trick. "Refraction," he muttered, holding out his hand toward the glow. The second his fingers crossed the light, a sound cracked through the silence, the unmistakable whisper of burning wood. The chimney flared orange from within. Clara screamed as she saw the stones glow, and then for just a breath a boy's face appeared beyond the light, white, hollow, eerily calm. The fire collapsed in on itself, vanishing without smoke or spark. When the air cleared, Walter's fingertips were blistered. No wood had burned. Nothing around them had changed, except the ground where fresh footprints now led into the trees. Henry wanted to leave. Walter refused. "This is extraordinary," he said, voice trembling but alive with wonder. "We are documenting mass hysteria, an entire town myth embodied through shared perception. If we leave now, we lose everything." Against Clara's protest, they stayed one more night. That decision sealed their fates. The following evening, as twilight sank, Walter noted strange temperature fluctuations on his instruments. He asked Henry to mark a perimeter and Clara to record readings every 5 minutes. But when Clara returned to camp half an hour later, Henry was gone. His pack still lay by the fire, his notebook open on a half-finished sentence. Written across the final page in someone else's handwriting were 3 words: "Feed the fire." Walter searched through the night, shouting until his voice cracked, but found nothing. By dawn, the woods had turned grey with mist. The forest floor steamed like ground over hot coals. Small patches of glass glistened beneath the soil, melted smooth. When they reached the creek, Clara saw something floating downstream, a piece of grey cloth, the same uniform remnant Samuel Hensley's men had described 20 years earlier. "You see it now, don't you?" she whispered, trembling. "He's still here." Walter didn't answer. They returned to camp, gathered their equipment, and began hiking out. Yet every compass in Walter's bag spun endlessly. The sun, when it rose, seemed to hang fixed above the trees. By noon, they passed the same ridge 3 separate times. At last, exhausted, they stumbled back into the clearing they'd left that morning. The chimney waited, black and silent. And beside it stood Henry, barefoot, pale, his eyes bright with reflection. "I found him," he said softly. "He showed me where the light comes from." Walter took a step forward, stunned. "Henry, we thought—" "Don't fight it, Doctor," Henry interrupted calmly. "He only wants what he lost." Then he smiled, and the air around him shimmered red. Walter grabbed Clara and ran as wind tore through the trees, carrying the rising sound of crackling fire. Behind them, Henry's voice echoed across the clearing, not screaming but singing something faint and rhythmic, a lullaby drowned in heat. They burst through the ridge as smoke rolled after them. By the time they reached open fields, nothing remained but distant glow. They collapsed near the road, coughing, skin burned, clothes scorched. Their journals were mostly ruined. Clara begged to leave Georgia, but Walter stayed 2 more days, wandering the outskirts with his bandaged hands. When finally he returned to Atlanta, he published nothing. His notebooks were sealed, never cited. Years later, after his death, Clara donated his papers to the university archive. Among them was one photograph, taken that first night at camp. Time had faded its edges, but near the bottom left corner, reflected faintly in the chimney stone, a boy's face stared back, calm, hollow, and waiting. In 1936, the Holloway tragedy resurfaced in whispers when a new highway was proposed through the abandoned farmlands of Marrow County. The government surveyors who reviewed the terrain dismissed the region's reputation as an old ghost tale from poorer times. But engineers soon discovered that the soil there behaved unlike any other, soft yet scorched beneath the surface, as if burned decades ago and never cooled. Machinery overheated inexplicably, metal warped. After 2 failed attempts to pave the route, workers began quitting in droves. Still, one foreman stayed behind, determined to finish the job. His name was Daniel Cooper, a former soldier hardened by war, unshaken by superstition. He had seen worse than fire and didn't believe in curses. When he took over the project, dozens of men followed him reluctantly. They set up their main camp half a mile west of the old Holloway property. On the first day, Daniel noticed that strange glassy patches glimmered across the fields. When struck by sunlight, they reflected faint orange as if holding ember light inside. He thought nothing of it. The first week went smoothly. The second did not. One night, the equipment manager Hall woke to the sound of footsteps outside his cabin. Thinking it was one of the younger workers, he stepped out to scold them for leaving lanterns burning. But when he looked toward the road, every lantern flickered out simultaneously. Only a faint red pulse glowed over the distant field. The sound of wind carried a child's laugh, light, breathless, and far too close. Hall screamed, dragging others from sleep. When Daniel arrived with a flashlight, the field was empty, the road dark and cold. In the morning, they found black triangles drawn in soot along the storage shed doors. Hall left that afternoon. Daniel refused to leave. He doubled the shifts and forbade any talk of curses. "Fire spreads on fear," he said, trying to sound confident. But the men were restless. They claimed to see lights near the tree line at dusk, white one moment, red the next, moving with slow rhythm like breathing. One worker collapsed from heat exhaustion, despite the cool evenings. Another said he found his boots filled with ash. The camp doctor blamed local contagion. Daniel told them all the same thing. "We finished the job." On the 15th day, a grader engine exploded without cause. No spark, no fuel leak. It burst into flame as if something had ignited it from within. 3 men were injured before the fire died on its own, leaving the machine completely hollow. Metal plates melted inward. Afterward, Daniel examined the wreck. Inside the charred frame, pressed into the dirt, was a perfect triangle. It wasn't scratched or drawn. It was burned deep, as if the ground itself had branded it. That night, storm clouds gathered over Marrow Creek or what remained of it. The rain fell heavy, flooding trenches meant for asphalt. Daniel huddled in the operations tent, scribbling notes on repairs. Wind tore through camp, but beneath the noise he thought he heard something else, faint, rhythmic, like someone whispering words he couldn't understand. Then he realized the whisper wasn't outside. It came from one of the radio sets on the table. The device had somehow switched on, though no one had touched it. Static pulsed for several seconds, followed by a voice. Young, male, calm. "Keep the fire warm." The lights blinked out. Daniel froze, sweat running down his back, though the air was cold. "Who is this?" he demanded, shaking the receiver. Only silence answered. He pulled the cord from the generator, tossed the radio aside, and sat breathing hard until dawn crept in grey and still. By morning, the camp was gone. Not destroyed, simply empty. Dozens of bunks stood untouched, steam still rising from coffee cups, papers pinned under stones. Every tool remained where it had been, but not a single worker could be found. Daniel searched the trails, shouting until his throat burned. Near the roadbed he found footprints, not adult but small, scattered in every direction. The same muddy marks that had haunted Sheriff Daltrey 43 years before. He followed them until they vanished by the creek. There he found one relic, a lantern sitting upright in the mud, glass shimmering faintly red though no flame burned inside. Against his better judgment, he picked it up. The metal was warm as if held moments before. Turning it over, he saw the initials PH scratched faintly near the rim. His chest tightened. He dropped the lantern back into the creek, watching it sink slowly beneath the water, the glow fading until only ripples remained. Daniel walked for hours, desperate to find any trace of his men. The forest closed around him, swallowing the sun. When he reached the old Holloway clearing, he stopped. The chimney still stood, cracked, moss-eaten, and surrounded by a ring of new stones. Each one had been freshly blackened, arranged in the same circle the sheriff had documented decades earlier. In the center, someone had placed a pair of boots. Inside them, folded neatly, lay a single torn page from an engineering log. Written in pencil across the top, "It follows what it remembers." The sky dimmed. Wind hissed through the dead grass like breath. Daniel turned to leave, but a voice stopped him. Soft, measured, no older than 16. "Don't go yet," it said. He froze. The boy stepped from the shadows of the chimney. His clothes were tattered, his eyes bright with that reflection that had haunted so many before. He looked calm, almost kind. "You shouldn't be here," Daniel said, though his voice shook. The boy tilted his head. "Neither should they," he answered. "But they came anyway. Where are my men?" Daniel shouted. The boy only smiled sadly. "Gone but not gone. The fire keeps what it needs." Then he raised one hand, palm open. Inside it glowed faint orange light. "You brought more for me." Flames erupted from the ground. Daniel ran, the heat chasing him, searing his lungs. Through the roar he heard that same whisper, endless and steady. Not pleading, not cruel, simply inevitable. By the time rescuers arrived 2 days later, the site was a hollow shell of glass and ash. No bodies, no survivors. Only Daniel's dog tags fused into the earth beside a melted radio. The highway was never built. On maps today, the area remains marked as unfit terrain. But pilots flying over Marrow County on still nights have reported seeing faint red glows flickering just below the tree canopy, moving in perfect circles, as though someone or something were keeping the fire warm. By the end of the century, few in Georgia still spoke the name Marrow Creek aloud. The land had been swallowed by forest and rumor, fenced off by the state under the guise of conservation. Locals avoided it, claiming their compasses faltered near its borders, and that cell reception died as soon as you crossed the ridge. But the legend of the boy who fed the fire lingered, passed down in truck stops and diners, by those who swore they'd seen strange lights drifting through the trees. In 1993, after a string of wildfires in neighboring counties, a small documentary crew from Atlanta traveled to the region to investigate. Their assignment was simple: produce an hour-long special on historical fire patterns in rural Georgia. The team consisted of producer Ellen Ward, cameraman Ty Reynolds, and sound operator Mark Lewis. They were professionals, skeptical of superstition, but they had read the fragments about Peter Holloway in county records. Ellen, pragmatic to the bone, thought it might make for a compelling opening sequence. A ghost story turned fire warning, she called it. She couldn't have known how literal those words would become. They arrived late afternoon, winding along back roads until they reached the old highway that had halted construction decades earlier. Beyond the yellow barrier, the road disappeared into thick pine, its surface cracked and overtaken by vines. Ty filmed the entrance, narrating lightly, joking about federal legends and cursed soil. Their local guide, an older man named Ford Jenkins, refused to go further. "I've seen enough glow in those woods for a lifetime," he said. "Sunsets here, you get moving." He turned his truck around and left them at the gate. That night, they made camp by the remnants of an old stone chimney, the same one that had survived generations of flame. Ellen noted that it seemed perfectly preserved despite time. Mark ran an audio test, picking up faint distortion, like a pulse. "Probably interference," he muttered. The forest around them was silent, unnaturally so. Even the insects seemed to avoid the place. When darkness fell, Ty switched on the camera's night lens and began filming slow pans of the surroundings. At exactly 9:43 p.m., the temperature dropped abruptly. Ellen checked her instruments in disbelief. 10 degrees in under a minute. Then came the scent, faint at first, then powerful. Smoke, dry and sharp, not drifting from their campfire but from the woods themselves. Ty aimed the camera toward the tree line. "You smell that?" he whispered. Mark nodded, adjusting his microphone. "It's close," he said. A light appeared among the trees, not white, not yellow, but dull orange, flickering softly as if someone carried an old lantern. Ellen called out, thinking it might be another camper or a ranger. No one answered. The light swayed once, then multiplied, forming 3, 4, 5 distinct glows drifting between the trunks. Ty kept filming, zooming in. Through the lens, he saw shapes, faint outlines of figures moving in rhythm, circling something unseen. They looked too small to be adults. Ellen stepped forward despite the others' protests. "Probably kids playing with torches," she said, but her voice wavered. The ground felt warm beneath her boots. When she reached the first row of trees, the lights vanished. In their place stood only shadows. Then out of the dark, a quiet voice spoke. "Fire eats, it just doesn't have hands." She froze. The sound came from her left, calm, measured, as though reciting memory. "Hello?" she called. The forest gave no reply. Behind her, Ty shouted for her to come back. She turned, and something flickered at the corner of her vision. A pale boy standing by the chimney, eyes reflecting orange light, though there was no fire near him. She blinked, and he was gone. They left that night but returned the following morning to finish their footage. Ty reviewed the tape during breakfast, his face drained of color as he watched the playback. "You were right, Ellen," he said quietly. "There were kids." He rewound the segment, slowing it down. In the frame behind the drifting lights stood several shapes, child-sized, motionless. Their faces, when the camera focused, were blackened silhouettes, mouths open as if mid-breath. Then came a flash, brief but distinct. A single boy at the center, lantern in hand, staring directly into the lens. Ellen decided to leave that afternoon, but by mid-morning smoke began rising from the ridge they had filmed the night before. Thinking someone had started a forest fire, she grabbed a radio to call county services. The signal cracked, filled with static. Then through the noise words formed, layered, overlapping, childish in tone. "Keep the fire warm." The phrase repeated until the radio melted in her hands, plastic dripping to the ground. Ty's camera began recording on its own, its red light flickering even after the batteries were removed. The lens turned slowly, framing the chimney again. Ellen felt the heat before the fire appeared, a suffocating wave rolling from beneath the soil. The earth hissed. Mark screamed. Flames burst from the grass in a perfect ring around them, roaring yet silent, refusing to give off smoke. In the center of the fire, the same figure emerged, Peter Holloway, just as described in every account before them, 16 years eternal, calm as the first day he had watched his world burn. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. Helen reached for Ty, pulling him toward the slope. The fire parted before them, opening a narrow path to the trees. They ran until their lungs tore. Behind them, the circle collapsed inward, devouring itself until nothing but white ash remained. When they reached the car, Ellen looked back one last time. In the haze drifting across the field, she saw the boy's outline still standing, the lantern raised. The footage was found a month later, after wildfire crews contained a series of unexplained blazes across the area. The tape cut abruptly, ending with the sound of wind and faint laughter. The government sealed the investigation, labeling it a chemical ignition zone. Ellen and Mark vanished. Ty was found beside the road outside Fair Hollow, burned on one side of his body, but alive. The last words he spoke before falling silent were written in his hospital report, scrawled over trembling handwriting. "It remembers. It's still hungry." Today, pilots flying low over that stretch of forest claim to see flickers of light weaving through the darkness, steady and circular. And those who listen carefully on certain quiet nights say they can still hear voices whispering through the pines, children's voices, calling softly from the fire that never dies. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.